enjoy the program today. The person speaking right now is Amy Lauricella. I'm a sexual assault survivor and a staff attorney for Standpoint. I'll introduce the rest of our people in just a minute, but first, just a little bit about Standpoint. For those of you who don't know, we are a resource to both survivors as well as any of the practitioners or system actors that work with them. The folks that have experienced domestic sexual violence or trafficking, basically anything gender-based violence in the state of Minnesota, we are a free resource here for you. So we answer many questions, legal in nature. We also have 2 advocates on staff, and so we can provide advocacy support as well to survivors in the state, as well as any of the attorneys, law enforcement officers, probation officers, private attorneys that might be working with us. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Ty to share a little bit about the webinar today.
Hi, so I am Ty, the Advocate Support Program Manager at Standpoint, and I want to remind folks that this webinar today is being recorded. I will upload the recording onto our YouTube channel sometime this week or this coming week. So if you haven't checked out our YouTube channel, please do so. It's Standpoint MN, and also, when you do check it out, please subscribe. When you subscribe, you will get notifications when we upload new videos. During the webinar, should you have any questions, please type your questions in the questions tab on the control panel. Amy and Sarah will check in with me periodically throughout the presentation, and they'll answer the questions as time allows. Any questions that they don't get to, we will follow up with you after the webinar. And also, Amy and Sarah both have their contact information. If you have questions after the webinar, you can always reach out to them. Another thing, at the end of this webinar, an evaluation about today's webinar will be emailed to you. And it's a short 3-question evaluation. Please fill that out. We value your input, and it also helps us going forward for the future webinars that we have. But right now, I do have one poll question that would be helpful for our presenters to know. Please go ahead and select all that apply to you. Okay, so I will pull up the poll question. I have provided advocacy to survivors about identifying themselves as a survivor, if you've done any of these, to family or friends, online community, reporters, none of the above. So please go ahead and check all that apply. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close. Wait, I still see people answering. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll question now. And so we have 56% of our audience today have helped survivors identify themselves as a survivor to family or friends, 11% to the online community, 11% to reporters, and 11% have done none of the above yet. Okay, so with that, thank you everyone, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Amy to begin the webinar.
Thank you all for participating in that poll. I just want to say that information is helpful for Sarah and I to just kind of gauge the level of involvement of all of the advocates on the line with survivor disclosure, so we can focus more intently on the areas where folks have less experience. So we appreciate that. With that, I'll jump into the webinar. I want to let you all know that we'll plan to have 15 minutes at the very end of the webinar for Q&A. So we do reserve that time for that purpose. And, you know, if there ends up not being nearly as many questions, we can always all get out of here early. So that is just fine by us. So it'll be an hour and 15, scheduled to end around 3:15, and then with the whole thing closing at 3:30. with that, I'll give you a little bit more about me. So I am a somewhat recent acquirer of Standpoint. I'm a staff attorney here and provide legal advice and counsel to survivors as well as the folks that are working with them, in particular as it relates to civil law issues that come up. While that can mean orders for protection, harassment orders, restraining orders, those sorts of things, it more often involves talking with survivors and their allies about their rights within a civil lawsuit. So if they're in a position where they might want to be suing their abuser in court or perhaps defending against a lawsuit from their abuser at court. That's really my area of expertise. And then in addition to that, I have a background in employment law. So just a plug that you guys can always call Standpoint if you have any questions relating to any of those topics. And then I've asked Sarah Super to present with me today. She's a rape survivor and is a founder of a movement here that began in the Twin Cities that is now statewide and really almost national too, called Break the Silence Day. And I'll let Sarah say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I can share more as we go on, but I started this movement called Break the Silence after I was raped by an ex-boyfriend and chose to speak publicly about it. And so much of the considerations that we're going to be talking about have social implications as well as legal ones. And so Amy invited me to join you all today to talk about my personal experience saying Me Too.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, so with that, we will get moving here. So our objectives today for all, those of you on the call, especially in the era of Me Too, there are a lot of people that are adding their voices to this movement in many different ways. Sometimes it is just speaking out to loved ones, family and friends. Others, it's writing a blog or attempting to get published on Huffington Post, sharing on your social media networks, speaking publicly at events, or potentially even reaching out to traditional media for coverage. And I think that there is a great capacity for advocacy in the state of Minnesota to really provide support to those survivors while they're navigating that issue and really think through the legal and then also personal considerations that they might need to when it comes to public disclosure. So our goals for you is to just, help you continue to support survivors doing the work that you are already doing fantastically, help them issue spot when it comes to the personal, legal, or community dynamics that they might experience if they were to share their story publicly, and then also to identify resources that survivors can then share with their allies to really take some of that work and requirement of survivors to really educate the community, which is oftentimes what has happened when survivors break their silence. And so really trying to help arm them with things that they can share and pass on so that they don't have to do all of that heavy lifting themselves. So as all of you are aware, this month is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And the theme really for the 2018 Sexual Assault Awareness Month has been Embrace Your Voice. It has been sort of a call to survivors to raise their voices, to lift up and stand together and publicly identify as survivors, but also doing it in a way that is true to themselves and really embracing the power that there is in sharing and speaking out about your experiences. And while we certainly appreciate and applaud those survivors that are choosing to do this kind of activism, we also just want to try to flag some things that people want to consider and think through before doing that and taking that public step, because once it's been done, a lot of the time there's really no undoing that choice. So just really helping people to prepare for what might happen. So a little bit about me, more personally. I experienced a sexual assault when I was in college, and this is going to date me, but this was in 2001. Where I think all of us have heard various stories of campus sexual assault that are happening, and I completely have identified with many of them. At the time, it was a situation that involved quite a bit of heavy drinking, surrounding yourself with friends, but friends that, you don't necessarily know very well, the kind of thing that when parents talk about it afterwards, they always say, oh, I wish that we just prepared our children to make better choices, that sort of thing. When it happened, immediately after it happening, I disclosed to 3 people. One was an ex-boyfriend, one was a roommate, and one was a friend. And I was supported by 2 very intensely, and I appreciated that. And then one person um, really immediately, shut down my story, sided with the other person. And what that ultimately ended up resulting in was me just not talking to anybody about it ever again. Even though I had had support from 2 other individuals, that one moment and discussion where I felt shamed and minimized and blamed, really, and playing into a lot of the self-guilt that I also had, that was enough to send me into a pretty deep depression. I was still able to function, but at the time was not really recognizing it as such. Thankfully, I ended up just transferring colleges and having a really great experience after that at a different school, and really, embracing the opportunity to start over. But ultimately, I never spoke out about what I experienced for another 16 years, almost, yeah, 15 years. So ultimately, what that led to was over a decade of silence by me. Even though I had seen other stories, I went on to become an attorney. I worked with survivors of domestic violence and getting orders for protection, hearing, many of them experiencing similar things that I had experienced. And it never dawned on me that that's really what I had gone through. So what I ended up doing is participating in the movement that Sarah had started, the Break the Silence Stay movement, in one of the truth tellings, which we'll get into a little bit more in detail in this webinar. And really using that experience for me became very empowering, because I was able to control my own narrative and publicly speak about the grappling of emotions that I had. And, it was a positive thing. At the same time, when I had chosen to do that, I really hadn't thought through. I had no connection with advocacy because it had happened so far earlier. I hadn't really, reached out and sought formal services. I had given no thought to any sort of negative or unintended consequences. Thankfully, when I did eventually post and publish that I was a survivor on Facebook, I had done it in a way that, in light of the fact that I'm an attorney, I think that really informed a lot of the details and the narrative of the story that I shared. And it was something that I have also seen other people I know do, and do it in a way that has left them exposed to trolls and negative feedback. And I thankfully did not have to experience much of that, but I know many, many survivors who have. So that's one of the reasons, really, that I actively sought out Standpoint as a place of employment, was to use my own experience and really help to shape some of the tools and the resources that are out there for survivors to make these decisions in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and I'll share not necessarily a similar story, but a story of being sexually assaulted and breaking my silence. I was raped when I was 26 years old. So 3 years ago, I was raped by an ex-boyfriend who I had recently broken up with. He had broken into my house, my apartment, when I was on vacation, and was hiding in a closet when I arrived home. I was raped that night and escaped the situation by fleeing into my apartment's hallway, where my neighbors let me into their apartment and called the police. I didn't really go through a very intentional or deliberate thought process in terms of reporting because my neighbors called right away, but it felt at the time like what needed to be done. He was arrested that night and never left custody. We went through the criminal justice system, where he was sentenced to 12 years in prison, which I know is a very rare experience. But in the days following the rape, I told my family, I told my parents the night of. They met me at the hospital, but I told my sister and some of my extended family the next day, many of whom had known my perpetrator, my ex-boyfriend, who I had dated for 7 months. I told my supervisor because I had to miss work that day in order to file my order for protection. And I told a few close colleagues because I was constantly on the phone with investigators and police dealing with my case. And I told some close friends. And
overall, within that amount of disclosure, I heard a lot of people say me too. That these people who I had known for a long time that I thought I knew really well, um, by me telling them my story, I had unconsciously given them permission to tell me theirs. And I heard a lot of stories. Um, it impacted my choice to publicly identify myself as the victim. So by nature that my perpetrator was arrested, a day or two later, the story ran in local media, newspapers, and TV news and so forth. Um, and I chose 6 weeks after that rape to call up those reporters and say, I want to publicly identify myself as the victim of the crime. Um, Overall, I had a really positive experience with the reporters. I felt like they listened. I felt like they wrote my story in a very sensitive way. And when the story ran, I heard from hundreds of survivors, kind of echoing the same experience I had telling my friends, family, and colleagues that so many people were telling me that this had happened to them too. People kind of emerged out of the woodwork from my childhood or my grade school, high school experience, telling me about surviving sexual violence during their life. And I also heard from strangers. The people I didn't hear from were probably those who hadn't been assaulted, many of whom I assume haven't been assaulted, and simply didn't know what to say or what to do. And I found that silence to be extremely painful, especially since my case was public, that my perpetrator was someone I knew well, who I was connected to, whose family I knew. Um, it's a combination of sexual violence and domestic violence to have been raped by a partner, an ex-partner. Um, I felt believed in part because of the criminal justice system validating my story, first through charging him and then later through sentencing him. Um, but I very much felt like people didn't know how to support me when I chose to speak out. And so a lot of my work that I've done in the aftermath has really been about giving people the words and ways to interact with survivors in the aftermath, or when or if they choose to say me too.
Sarah, that reminds me and raises a good point that I was wanting to share as well. So it, during the actual or right after the actual assault for me, I was met with the immediate pushback, right? That was very silencing for me. But what I was not actually as prepared for, even though I was in the movement at the time and already working with so many survivors after I broke my silence, was that silence from friends and from family, many of whom I believe were, I choose to believe that they were just silent because they didn't want to say the wrong thing. Um, but that ended up being really damaging and something that I had to really grapple with and work through. And I'm still working on some of those relationships today, after being met with just the complete and utter lack of support, which I hope and like to attribute to them just not really having a good sense of what would work and what would help. So hopefully some of the resources at the end of our presentation today will ensure that other survivors don't have quite as tough of an experience.
And I also want to echo that on a larger level, the Me Too movement hasn't been met with anything. The Me Too movement has also been met with silence in a large way, in terms of there hasn't been a community of allies to rise up out of this. There hasn't been a wave of I believe survivors, or I stand with survivors. We haven't seen, I know sexual violence happens to people of all genders, but I think there's especially a silence coming from men. And just to like point out that um, I think I think the work of all of our organizations is trying to change this in a way, but I also recognize that this is still a common reality, for that when people say Me Too, people in the community don't know how to respond.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel as well. This slide here, recounts a couple of the experiences that we have seen happen publicly. There's the movement coming out of Hollywood that obviously, these are some I guess, arguably very high profile, powerful women and men who have been assaulted and harassed to a point that they were very unaware that it was going on at the level that it was happening. And they have chosen to spoke out and are putting together, that's where Time's Up came from, putting together an organization that is really working to figure out what to do next. But I do think that that's a very good point where, you know, we could get all of the advocacy organizations in the world, you know, actively moving in this direction, which arguably I think that's what we are doing. And up and until we get to a point where those people in power, who are oftentimes men, white men, until they are the ones that are starting to call for the protection from sexual assault in the workplace, or protection and prosecution of criminal sexual assault crimes, until that starts to happen, there really isn't going to be a whole lot of movement, because this is not something that is new. This isn't something that's been going on for centuries. So we shared these at least just two examples up here to show and remind everybody that, you know, while yes, Time's Up and MeToo has been a really high profile Hollywood storyline, there are a lot of other individuals in many other industries that still have not had that platform and that level of recognition from common, you know, from our mainstream society, including the agricultural laborers, 700,000 of which have come out and said they've experienced this at a massive level. That's not news. There are, you know, truckers that work for Teamsters unions that are still only 3% of the Teamster population and have absolutely no recourse, even though they've been speaking out about this for decades. Folks in restaurant industries, auto manufacturing plants, folks that do cleaning services. Standpoint gets phone calls from these sorts of individuals that have these kinds of jobs all the time, where assault is rampant, not even just sexual harassment, but assault is rampant, and they don't have anywhere to go to seek recourse for it. So this is still something that we are hoping, by continuing to shed light on it, by continuing to make it okay for others to speak out about it, there will eventually be we will see a change. I guess, Ty, are there any questions before we look into some of this?
None yet.
Okay, good. All right, so really what the webinar is intended to do is, you know, we're covering MeToo, we're talking about the importance, the benefits, as well as the consequences of sharing these experiences. And really, you know, honoring the fact that there is a great impact when we all unite and stand together and honor these stories, but then also to help issue spot with survivors while they consider what kinds of disclosure they want to pursue. You know, disclosure can mean as small as just sharing with your husband, or it might be as broad and public as going to the New York Times to share your story. And so depending on the kind of disclosure, depending on the reach of the disclosure, that can have a very different sort of impact on your life. And one of the things that I think many of the survivors that I've worked with since I've started my career, a lot of them have attempted to gauge how little or large the coverages that will happen with their story, and oftentimes they've been surprised at either how little or how broad their stories have reached. So that's just something to keep in mind. You know, with me, my disclosure was initially just verbal to a very few people, and it has kind of since grown from there, where I then participated in a public truth telling, and then shared with my vast online social media network. Sarah, yours was perhaps with less choice right off the bat, because your police disclosure was sort of automatic and it happened. But then you very intentionally sought out that traditional media platform and then shared on social media as well. And then, you know, many of the folks in the Me Too movement have added their voices on a social media level too. And so it's really just trying to identify some of these benefits and consequences that we have seen happen many times over, and then also acknowledging that the consequences or benefits are going to be very personal, and really listening to the survivors that we're working with and helping them identify them, because they're the experts on their own lives.
So I thought I might share some of the things that I found to be kind of more positive or effective or healing about speaking out before diving more into the lesser favorable consequences of speaking out. Overall, what I hope to convey is that there is no right way to heal, that we all heal differently, that choices have consequences. The choice to speak out doesn't mean that it's going to be like a pleasant outcome necessarily 100% of the time, but also keeping the story inside and silent is also not a promise of not dealing with the pain either. So what I'm here to say first and foremost is that there really isn't a right or wrong way, but that this was some of my experience. And so the first thing I would say is that it was empowering for me because it was totally my choice. I had the best advice I received in the wake of being raped was from a mentor of mine who said, Sarah, do whatever it is that you need to heal. That's the most important thing for you right now. And I recognize that for me, that meant talking about it. Again, I know that that's not everyone's way, but that's what I needed, and that was my choice. And I was able to act on my choice and to feel good in doing what I felt I needed to do. By also speaking out, I mentioned to you that by telling my story, others told theirs. And so the isolation that I felt the night of my rape quickly diminished when I recognized just how many people I knew had also experienced something of this nature. So that was maybe one of the sharpest learning curves I can even imagine in my lifetime. Was on the night of my assault, I could not name a single other person in my life who had also been raped, and that quickly changed. The isolation melted away as soon as I learned I truly wasn't alone. Um, it was healing for me because I felt that I could make an impact, that my story mattered. And I think, speaking to the previous slide about the difference between a Hollywood story and a laborer's story, that also speaks to the privilege that I had in this as a voice, but knowing that people listened to me in part because of what I looked like, the education I've received, the person that I've shown up as, the privilege I have. But it was a healing thing for me to know that my voice mattered. Um, I also felt like not necessarily did I receive support from allies from the get-go, but rather I connected people by telling them my story, by being public about being a survivor. I connected a lot of people who felt very distant from the issue of sexual violence, and I connected them closely to it. And so people like some of my friends and my parents, for example, who hadn't experienced sexual assault of this kind, who thought maybe it like that we somehow escaped it from not being assaulted during college or beforehand, who felt like some of that victim blaming, the stereotype of who this happens to, that lived on and manifested in part because of the silence. Um, and now all of a sudden here they had a real person that they knew in their life who experienced this. Additionally, I was able to challenge a lot of those stereotypes of who this happens to and how it happens and who commits this crime. My perpetrator was someone that all my friends knew, all my family knew. No one had ever said, Sarah, I think he could be dangerous. I think he could be violent. People considered him to be a good person. He was respected as an activist for environmental justice. He was a progressive person who lived in South Minneapolis in an intentional community with other liberal-minded people. This was, I think, a case that challenged a lot of people's understanding of sexual violence and brought them a lot closer to it. So for that, I'm sad, truthfully, that it took a personal experience in order to get people connected, but I also recognize that this is true for so many different issues that as soon as we recognize how close it is to us, it becomes a much more urgent matter for us to address it. So I feel like by telling my story, I've actually added more people to the movement.
Yeah, and I think that that's what many of us in the advocacy community try to do as well. You know, we try to empower the survivors that we work with. I know many of you on the call do this work every single day. And first and foremost, you know, you are working with the survivor in a way that maintains their autonomy, where they are the ones in the driver's seat, and that is absolutely the way that it should be. But I do think that it's important also as an advocacy community to, when appropriate and when safe for both the survivor and the advocacy organization, to challenge those commonly understood narratives of what is a typical sexual assault victim. Well, there isn't one, right? But we all have grown up in a society where we do have certain images and expectations of what should and should not qualify as a sexual assault. You know, what is appropriate behavior for a survivor to have engaged in prior to the assault that occurred, that sort of thing. And so not only are we providing that direct advocacy to the survivors that we work with, but we're also providing that systemic advocacy by sharing the stories and narratives that we know to be true as well.
Yeah, excuse me, one of the things I would add too about my work leading Break the Silence is um, I think so often people misinterpret what I'm doing as trying to get other survivors to speak out about their experiences. And that is definitely not what I'm trying to do. I think um, one of the things that I recognize is that the choice to break the silence is, I think, given to survivors because survivors are strong and courageous and inspiring, that they are capable of making their own choices, that they are capable of making, we are capable of making difficult choices, choices that don't always have positive outcomes. The choice to report or not to report doesn't have a happy ending really either way, or a positive experience either way, but it's still a choice. And I think that's what matters the most. The same is true for breaking the silence. Um, so one of the myths that I think is perpetuated out there about saying Me Too is that somehow it like lifts the pain, that somehow I've like erased or eliminated the stigma or the suffering, and that it's somehow the end goal of surviving sexual assault is to be able to talk about it. And this is simply not true. Um, by speaking out about it, I opened a whole new can of worms of suffering that I didn't know I'd experience. It's not to say that I regret it or that I wish I didn't. It's just recognizing that the choice that I made had some consequences that I wasn't necessarily planning on. And so one of those things was I was met with a lack of support. Again, people just didn't know what to say or do, and so they often said and did nothing. And that silence, the lack of response, felt strongly like apathy, that someone could do this to me and people couldn't care. Reminded me of feeling I had during the assault itself, like somehow my voice as a human person just didn't matter. Um, I mentioned again mismanaged expectations. I thought there might be like some magic button I could press or a pill to take that would somehow get rid of the way I was feeling. And speaking out about it changed the way I felt, but it didn't eliminate the suffering. I felt, and in part, this plays into previously before my rape, I was doing work around trauma, not necessarily around sexual, domestic violence, gender-based violence, but trauma, psychological trauma in general. And I found that it was very clear to me that my friends and family needed more information. And I felt so often that their learning how to support survivors happened at my expense rather than was proactive. I also recognized that there was a lack of resources out there for people to learn how to support. So I think that's in part what motivated Amy to organize this webinar. I'm currently writing a book on how to support survivors. I can share more later. But really that there wasn't that much out there that my mom and dad could quickly read, in a night, in order to know the things to say, the do's and don'ts. Additionally, becoming a very public survivor had advantages in some way. It gave me a credibility to speak out and do some of this work that I'm doing. It built trust with other survivors, but it also became a label that I couldn't really take off. I maybe one of the most obvious ways originally was that I was single and wanting to start dating. And this became a big challenge for me. Of course, like what's the first thing people do is you Google someone, or you Facebook them or look them up on social media. And the first thing that people would read about me was that I had just been raped, and the personal details and some public suffering tied to it. So it became a challenge in some way because there was such a stigma of what it means to be raped and what a rape survivor is capable of or willing to do, or you name it, in the context of a romantic relationship. And then I started to reframe it and recognize that I didn't want to date anyone who had a negative stereotype or a stigma that was attached to what it meant to be a survivor. So in a way, it became something I could reframe as a filter. Unfortunately, I found someone who didn't have those stereotypes. Uh, but one of the things I wanted to mention was that at the time that I spoke out, it was 6 weeks after my rape, and I still had not yet been assigned a prosecutor in the county criminal justice system. So I had actually no legal advice prior to me speaking out. And I can see, of course, looking back, how it could influence perhaps a court outcome. My case, I think people were confident because there was so much evidence, because I had gotten the rape kit minutes after the assault happened, because my perpetrator was arrested minutes after it happened. And there was a lot of evidence to show just how much planning and deliberation went into the attack. Again, I mentioned he broke into my home and had been hiding in it. So there was evidence there that's not necessarily exists in common experiences of sexual violence. But someone said to me, Sarah, by nature of you doing work with people who suffer from trauma, they could spin this as you trying to like get ahead in your career, or using this as somehow a professional platform to to drum up business. And fortunately, that's not what happened. But in terms of speaking out in the midst of the court process, I know others who choose to speak out after the court process is over.
Yeah, I want to echo a couple of the points that you made, Sarah, too, just from the perspective of our work here at Standpoint. I've only been here for, I believe, 2 short months at this point, and I've already gotten a number of phone calls, not from survivors or the advocates that are working with them, but actually from family members who had been Googling themselves. And, I got a phone call the other day from someone who had just learned that their niece was a rape survivor. And the gentleman said to me, well, Jezebel doesn't have anything on this. How am I supposed to know what I'm doing? And he had just been Googling random articles and had just come up with really not a whole lot of guidance about how to support a survivor, and then also not a lot of guidance about what are your options as a survivor, because that was really what he was trying to do for her, and that was his way of helping, was presenting her with a whole bunch of options and going from there. And I think that's really what we're trying to do with this webinar, as you said, is really arm advocates and the survivors that they work with these resources, so that we can try to minimize the damage that's done by silent or on the worse end, those family members that minimize the abuse that's occurred. Many of the survivors that I've worked with have, they've spoken out in a lot of different capacities, some very publicly to the media. Others, it might just have been putting something, speaking out publicly at a small event, and they're from a small community. And so many people find out and recognize that they're survivors very quickly. That kind of stuff spreads like wildfire when your community is smaller. And I know many of them do, there are negative consequences that have come for many of them. It ranges the gamut from they're, fully unemployable because people have such a misconception of who they are and what they've experienced that just is no longer something that is really an option for them. Many have concerns about future relationships, that kind of thing. It has resulted in the termination of family relationships where because of the response or lack of response or negative response, they really don't have any sort of family support system. And so it's really talking through, what I've found helpful is really talking through with survivors prior to that disclosure, if possible, what are your concerns about this? And what, if this were to happen, how would you feel about that? And really ensuring that they're as prepared as they possibly can be, but also knowing that there's no way we could possibly prepare them for everything. With that, we're going to go into a little bit of a section that I won't make too dry for all of you, but I think it is important for advocacy to at least just be aware of some of the legal consequences that can come up. Sarah alluded to some of them in her experience where, and I've heard this from many survivors actually, who when a criminal prosecution is ongoing or even just a criminal investigation, almost the threat is made of, please don't speak out about this because it's going to affect the case and we're not going to be able to take it forward, and that will be all on your shoulders, really has been the message that I've heard conveyed time and again. So while, yes, it can have an impact on criminal proceedings, it also can have an impact on other newer proceedings that might arise from the actual publication itself. And for that, I mean, we're seeing a trend where survivors are being sued in civil court by their abusers for defamation and libel and the torts related to that. It's a tactic that is used often to silence survivors and individuals and intimidate them. We've seen it in really high profile cases all the way up to Donald Trump. We also see it occurring, on the front end prior to a lawsuit being filed, where survivors who have perpetrators who have a lot of resources are followed by private investigators. There are people hired to dig up dirt on them. There's all sorts of things that have happened that we're aware of publicly. And so what I'm hopeful here is that I can at least just flag this as a potential issue to talk through with survivors, and just know that if any concerns or questions arise as it relates to defamation or potentially being sued in civil court, that is why Standpoint is here. That is one of the reasons that they hired me, is I can talk you and the survivors you work with through these kinds of cases, help you troubleshoot, help you issue spot, and should it be necessary, try to find you and connect you guys with an attorney to help represent you, because these are complicated matters. The one thing I will also say is many of these defamation cases, if they do go all the way to trial, they can take a really long time and they can have a really significant emotional impact on survivors. And all it really takes for a claim to at least be actionable, I will say, is just publication to any third party. It doesn't need to be put out on Facebook for everybody to see. It could simply be sharing with your best friend. Your best friend then shares with somebody else, perpetrator finds out, and that is it, right? So the publication itself does not have to be on a large scale for a defamation claim to at least make it past just that very initial first step in a lawsuit. The elements, though, that do have to be shown is that the communication, yes, it was published, yes, it was to a third party, but fundamentally that the communication was false. Now, on the civil side, we are not dealing with the same burden of proof that we are in a criminal case. So we're not looking at proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Somebody needs to prove that the communication was false by a preponderance of the evidence, which to explain what that sounds like, it's really just more likely than not it happened. So if you have two little scales and you're looking and they're totally even, basically just as soon as that scale shifts ever so slightly, that's what we're talking about. So a perpetrator who is looking to use this kind of mechanism to harass and intimidate a survivor would have to show that the communication was false by a preponderance of the evidence. truth is a defense to this. Obviously, if they're entitled to prove that it's false, the survivor can come back and assert the defense that what happened is truthful and that what was said was truthful. But unfortunately, that can't happen until you get all the way to a trial. And so that's why I say these can be really long and expensive proceedings sometimes, because it can take quite a while to get to that point. And obviously the emotional toll is huge. It's not to say that if a survivor gets sued for defamation, all is lost. There are a lot of things that we can do. There are a lot of tactics that I've seen be really helpful and useful in these kinds of cases. Things like counterclaiming in the lawsuit for the pain and suffering that the survivor has experienced because of the sexual assault, or the intentional infliction of emotional distress, things like that. So, we certainly have strategies that can hopefully result in the lawsuits going away quickly, depending on who the perpetrator is and what their motive is. But it still is something that, should be thought through prior to public disclosure, if at all possible. We've also seen this in particular happening in cases involving campus sexual assault, where a survivor will report to their Title IX office. The investigation is conducted. Depending on how the school and the commission responds, then we have seen perpetrators and their counsel sue the school and the survivors in court after that point for what happened. Oftentimes if it results in an expulsion, or a loss of scholarship, things of that nature. We have seen defamation cases in that context, many of which have been successful, and at least successful in settling or resulting in some sort of benefit or fixing of what the perpetrator believes to be a wrong. And so we're monitoring a lot of these cases because obviously the intention of Title IX is to provide the survivors first and foremost with a remedy that might be a dorm change or something like that. But it's exposing schools and survivors in the sort of as a bystander almost in the process to this level of liability. The other case that I think is really particularly important for advocacy in Minnesota to know is the Maithner versus Someplace Safe case. It involved a perpetrator who sued his former partner who had spoken out at a Someplace Safe event where she was being awarded as a survivor. She was receiving an award of courage, and spoke out about what she'd experienced and how she had gone from surviving what she'd experienced to thriving despite that experience. And she published a blog post on the Someplace Safe newsletter. And the person in this case sued both Someplace Safe and the survivor. In the lower court, the court ended up dismissing the case at the summary judgment stage, and he and his counsel appealed. And the Court of Appeals earlier, I think maybe it was early February, issued a published decision that was fairly problematic for advocacy and for survivors in putting together a defense to these claims. Currently, Someplace Safe's counsel, as well as a number of individuals, have requested that the Supreme Court take up review of this case. We don't know yet if that's going to happen, but to the extent it does, there will definitely be some more resources coming out for those advocacy organizations who are looking to still, honor survivors publicly and provide survivors a platform for speaking out, and giving them a little bit more cover. So I say all of this just to let many of you know, should you have a concern that you'll be worried that either your organization or a survivor you work with is likely to get sued. I know many perpetrators will threaten that when the blog post first appears online. Take it down or I'm going to sue you. Feel free to call us and we can talk through these kinds of issues, issue spot with you, get you some resources, ensure that if you do end up needing counsel, we connect you with counsel or provide your counsel with helpful context for depositions, preparing for protective orders, for certain documentation and testimony and all of that. The other thing that's not on here that I wanted to raise too is the other potential for legal complications is if there are any other pending matters, if there's a pending divorce matter or something happening in family court, and a survivor is speaking publicly about the experiences that he or she has had, a lot of that is possibly going to be used against them in the family law proceedings. And so to the extent any survivor is thinking about sharing this, their experiences beyond maybe just their very close and trusted family and friends, I encourage the advocacy on the phone to have them speak with their attorneys prior to doing that, just to ensure that they're not doing damage to their case in the long run. And then, yeah, just the last point is, while yes, the court system, is not always there to work for survivors in the civil context with the available remedies that are there in personal injury actions, damage to property, defamation that a survivor herself or himself might have experienced, intentional infliction of emotional distress. These are all potential counterclaims that can be not only, successful in the long run, but also be useful tools to trying to get the process to just go away as quickly as possible, depending on what the survivor's needs are. So now we're on to the media considerations. And by media in this context, we're thinking more about things that have a broader readership. So more traditional media sources, newspaper articles, local news. It could certainly mean social media, depending on the nature of the story. If it's a blog post that has been published by Scary Mommy and it is going viral, that sort of thing. So it's not just traditional media. We have to start thinking creatively about how our modes of communication do have a broad reach beyond just our immediate circle. But we want to just flag some of these things for all of you to talk with survivors about, because a lot of these things have been sort of figured out after the fact, I think, by survivors who have been put into a media spotlight. And so hopefully if people know about them ahead of time, they can use some of these tools to their advantage. So, whoops, I just got muted for a second there. So yeah, I've heard from a lot of survivors who have spoken with newspaper reporters or gone on the news. And during that experience, many of them have said, I really didn't know that I could ask for certain things. I didn't know I could ask for certain details to be kept out of the article, or if a particular way they were talking about me really was problematic for me, I could ask that if they publish anything about me in the future, they steer clear of that phrasing or that nickname or whatever it was that the survivor was taking issue with. They could certainly try to make a request for exactly when the publication was going to happen. Even just the means that they were communicating with reporters. Sometimes survivors don't realize that they can say, listen, I'm only going to be available by email, and we can set up a time to talk, and then we'll, do it that way. Please don't call my cell phone. I won't be picking up. Things like that have proven to be really helpful once some of that agency and I think control is returned to the survivor. And then, yeah, just the unintended consequence a lot of the time of publication. While it is foreseeable, it is certainly not what anybody hopes to have happen with their stories being shared, the troll effect, and really being aware of having a plan for how to deal with negative commenters, folks that might spend a lot of time targeting a survivor after they share their story. Really just having a plan. And I don't know, Sarah, did you have any sort of plan or anything in place when you shared your story with the media?
I didn't have any plan. I guess I had no idea what to expect, other than I just wanted to be able to talk about it freely, and also get the support that I think survivors deserve and so rarely get. In terms of trolls, I didn't have, if I have trolls, I don't know. But I will say that there were comments made. For example, on some of the news stories, there are trolls out there who commented, like, stating very violent things they would do to my perpetrator. So it wasn't necessarily against me or shaming or blaming me necessarily, but it's like that's definitely not what I'm after. That's not my understanding or definition of justice. But and social media is like, it's so easy to comment or say like, no, that's not what I'm looking for here. But I kind of think that for me, the best tactic now, having done more of this work, and it's not necessarily just my story in the news, but more the activism that I'm doing, it certainly gets people who critique it, who see things very differently than I do. And I've just learned, like, I just don't read the comments, and I don't choose to respond to people who I disagree with in that kind of avenue. But I know that other people might choose differently. Again, knowing that there are trolls, knowing that there are people who write invalidating, shaming, blaming comments to news articles doesn't mean that a survivor is incapable of seeing those. It's just an awareness that it might be part of the choice.
Yeah, I'll say I have not experienced trolls about my own story, but just even in, public writings, it's really amazing how you would never expect the reach to be as broad as it is, and, really be unprepared for some of the very negative and hurtful comments and threatening comments that can happen. I've been on the receiving end of that just from writing an article in one of my jobs, and an article that I had not expected to be divisive. And folks that have shared experiences or have shared opinions that they wouldn't expect to be divisive can be. And so just being really cautious and intentional when we're talking with survivors about what that means for how they can conduct their lives afterwards. Because some of this can get to the level where a survivor is in fear, even just in her own apartment, because of the use of technology and what a perpetrator can do, or what trolls and folks that are not allies can do. So with that, we want to arm all of you incredible advocates with a model about choice that Sarah has put together and really honed over her years of activism and advocacy. And it's something that I found very helpful when I first disclosed to all of my friends and family, after my 15 years of silence. Sharing this model with them proved to be a really helpful way for me to put a lot of the burden back on them to do some work and educate and really be thoughtful and intentional about how they were interacting with me, and also really gave me quite a bit of autonomy that I didn't realize I needed at the time, but did.
So the model starts by offering more than one tangible option, offering an opt-out when it's possible, and then making sure to validate that all of the options that were given are real options, and that it's their choice. So it could sound something like, if you'd like to attend a Break the Silence truth telling, you could show up and choose to speak out and break the silence. If you'd rather just show up and listen, that's okay too. Or if this isn't the type of event you want to go to, totally okay. Your choice. Whatever you need right now works for me. I support you either way. So we've given the option of showing up to speak, showing up to listen, the opt-out if you'd rather not go, and then validating everything as if you'd rather not. That's okay too. Your choice. This might, from an advocate or a friend or family member, look like saying, do you want to talk about what you're going through right now? If you'd rather just do something else or talk about something else to take your mind off it, I'm game for that. If you want some space or just some quiet time, whatever you need works for me. I support you, whatever you need. Um, I often say, I support you however you choose to heal. One of the reasons why I learned it's important to offer more than one option is because oftentimes by the way that we ask a question, it alludes to some form of judgment or expectation that they're going to do what we're asking of them. So, like, do you want to say me too? Or do you want to break the silence? Imagine me saying to survivors, do you want to come to a truth-telling event? They could, the question ends with a question mark, but they hear that I've started this organization and I'm the founder of it and I chose to do it myself. They could perceive that by me asking, do you want to come to a truth-telling event, that they are supposed to say yes, and that if they are to say no, they would somehow be hurting my feelings, or maybe even making me angry. And imagine the fear that comes with turning a person down or upsetting someone, or not like um, following through on what someone's hoping that you'll do. Where so much of the violence I think happens is especially in the context of child abuse or domestic violence, where it's letting a person down or rejecting someone's offer or what they want. The idea of saying no becomes a lot more frightening. So the simplest way to offer a trauma-sensitive choice is by offering one option, such as, do you want to come to a truth-telling? And if the other option is simply not coming to the truth-telling, the opt-out is, if you'd rather not, that's okay too. I support you either way. I'd be happy to answer more questions if there's questions.
Yeah, well, Ty checks on that. I want to just put a little bit of an advocacy spin on this too. So much of the work that we all do is to empower survivors and to really help them regain that agency. It might be a simple action of, if a family member is the one who's calling us, it's letting them know that they can pass on to the survivor that we're a resource for them, but that it is absolutely up to the survivor to call us back, and we would be happy to work with them. But that it is not something where the family member should really be pushing this as the answer, the option for them. Because I think when it comes to our role as advocacy, Sarah, when you and I were preparing for this webinar, we talked through, is it just to protect survivors, or is it really to help contribute to their healing? And so I believe it's the latter. I believe that it's to contribute to their healing. And so that means we need to be giving them meaningful choices, and really arming them with the best information we can provide to them, but knowing that they might not choose the option that we believe is the best for them, and being okay with that can be challenging in our work, but also is really fundamentally, I think, the purpose of what we do, is to give them back their agency and their autonomy, and empower them, which contributes to their healing.
Yeah, I have been, I keep coming back to a quote from Dr. Judith Herman that says that no intervention that takes power away from the victim, away from the survivor, can possibly foster their recovery, no matter how much it appears to be in their immediate best interest. So if we feel like we can choose for them because it'll save them from some suffering, or not give them some information because it's going to be too hard for them to hear and not the day they should hear it, just those words, those phrases of what they should do or what we think they need, if we haven't consulted with them or asked for their input or permission, we're going to replicate the perpetrator's actions of making choice for the person without the person. I think the reason that choices are so important, as we all know, is that survivors don't have choices in the experience of sexual violence, and so the need to have choices in the aftermath, and particularly not just to have choices, but to sense choices, to feel like there are choices, is something that I think is harder to recognize in the aftermath of sexual violence or traumatic experiences.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out here for those listening, there is a handout that's available with this webinar. It's titled "What to Expect If You Choose to Break the Silence," or excuse me, knowing what to say to a trauma survivor. This is something that Sarah wrote that does talk through this choice model, as well as other ways that allies can, sort of get a sense for what's appropriate to say. And the fact that, yes, you do have to say something, and you should say something. And it kind of gives them permission in a way to fumble through it if that's the way that they have to go about it, but in a way that's supportive. So that handout in particular, I think, is one that if advocacy chooses to share with survivors that they're working with, so that those survivors can pass it on to their supporters and their allies, I think that's something that would be very helpful. Ty, before we go on, did you have any questions at all?
Yeah, so the question is, as an advocate and when you're working with a survivor and giving survivors multiple options, a lot of times the survivor will come back to you and say, what do you think is the best option for me? And so from your experience, Amy and Sarah, like what would be the most appropriate answer to respond to the survivor? Because you want to be mindful and intentional of not making choices for the survivor, but also wanting, because they're asking you what you
Yeah.
feel like the best option should be.
I think that really the deliberate, intentional ask for advice is so fair. That when someone asks for advice, that's like when it's best received. If people are just simply told what to do, or do you want to do this, or you should do this, that has such a different impact. But one idea for that situation, if someone was to say, like, what do you think I should do? Um, I get asked that often, and I feel like I still don't answer them directly. What I simply do is say, I really think only you know what to do in this. Um, but let's talk through what are the potential outcomes of some of
Right.
these choices, and maybe once we talk through what could come from those options, or if you chose option A versus option B, maybe you'll have a clear idea of what's right for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do something very
Yeah.
similar too, where if it seems like they're really struggling with a particular decision, letting them know that they really are the experts on their own lives and their own experiences, and how those around them are going to respond. And so I'll also do a little bit of projecting out with them, ask them reflective questions that will help them to kind of think through, what does this look like for them?
Mhm.
It doesn't answer their question, and it certainly doesn't feel quite right as you're offering guidance to not answer their question directly. But I think you're right that, to help them really find their voice in this, and choose for themselves, is something that it can be done even when directly asked for it.
Mhm. And I want to say too, from my experience as being, and from my experience as an advocate too, that sometimes when you're working with people from different cultures, I know, 'cause I'm from the Lao community, and when I'm working with people from the Lao community, they see me as a professional, and my opinion is something that they really look up to, and they want to do what I feel like is best. And that's when it becomes really difficult. So if you're an advocate working with someone from, a different community, a different cultural background, just know though that you really have to be more careful when you um, give or offer advice or suggestions, because sometimes um, people tend to want to do what you suggest versus what they feel like is the right thing to do, just because they will look at you to be the expert in that area. And so, I mean, I've had to do that numerous times, and I have to always kind of check myself on that, just to know the amount of weight that is applied to sometimes options that I'm giving to survivors. But that was the only question, so.
So I do want to take a minute and open it up to see if others do have questions that they have been holding off until the end. If they want to write those in, we'll just take a quick minute to see if anybody's still thinking
Okay.
through some of this stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, or if you want to give people the opportunity to ask at the end too, is fine. I don't see any questions coming in right now, so just to
Okay.
be
Okay.
mindful of the time. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And I want to be mindful of everyone's time too. This next slide right here, we'll go through just really quickly. It ties, I think, actually very closely with the question that we just received, of helping folks really weigh those potential benefits and consequences, and ensuring that they have meaningful choice. Some of these smaller bullet points here are just sort of reflective questions that I have found very helpful to guide, that really does not pass judgment on any of the decisions or options available. And really ensuring that that you're flagging major issues for them, but still leaving them with their own real way to make a choice about it. Because these are big decisions, and we do want the survivors we work with to come away with a sense that they made these choices themselves. Because if they don't feel like they made that choice themselves, not only, are you contributing or compounding that trauma, then we're also not, really not doing the service that we need to be doing as advocacy. And so just want to flag right here this resources page. As I've said a couple of times, and I'm still going to say it again, Standpoint, we have attorneys and advocates who are always here. We run a hotline. You can call us. The contact information is on our website, which is standpointmn.org. Contact us with any questions, concerns that folks have about disclosure, legal liability, thinking through potential life, community, personal considerations. That's what we're here for. I've included one of the handouts available with this webinar is a list of just resources that Sarah has compiled through her work. The first is that knowing what to say to a trauma survivor handout that I mentioned, the thing that can be shared directly with allies by the survivor. There's also a piece of what to expect if you choose to break the silence that Sarah wrote after her public disclosure, and really receiving all of the MeToo and then also the responses that she's got and the silence that she received from many of the individuals. And this is something that would just kind of help to prepare survivors. It's hard for them to, when we're working with them, especially if it's just a short-term meeting or relationship, to really take in all of the things that we're talking with them about. So sending them home with some of these things is not necessarily a bad idea, to allow them more time to process and to really ensure that they're making an informed choice. Another resource that I want to flag for all of the advocates that you may not be aware of is there are a couple of Facebook pages out there that are for survivors of sexual assault. Or sexual violence. The Break the Silence Day on Facebook is a public page that Sarah has started that is run by survivors, that is really putting a public face on the trauma that survivors experience. But it's also a way that survivors in our Minnesota community can access. There's a secret survivor group where survivors can share experiences, ask for resources, sometimes just talk about things that are wholly unrelated to the sexual violence that they experienced. And it has proven to be, for some, a very helpful resource. Again, if not, that's okay too. But if folks do want to be connected with that secret survivor group on Facebook, they can just search the @Break the Silence Day handle and request to be added. And then, Sarah, I think maybe just take a quick minute to talk through the memorial project that you have going on.
Yeah, the memorial is really about kind of I feel like the silence that was so overwhelming when I spoke out inspired this project, really, in terms of not just the need for my friends and family to acknowledge what happened to me, but also for the community to talk about sexual violence in a public and ongoing way, that this wasn't just a Me Too moment, right? It's a Me Too movement. It's something that needs to be happening continuously. And I sometimes I fear that Sexual Assault Awareness Month limits the conversation, but it's our job as advocates and allies and activists to continue to converse about sexual violence and to bring more people into the conversation. The memorial is a permanent structure that will be built in Booma Island Park in Northeast Minneapolis along the Mississippi River. It's right along, very close to downtown. And the concept mirrors two metaphors: the use of ripples, that by telling our stories, we unconsciously give others permission to tell theirs, and the use of mosaic, that broken pieces can be put together to create something new and something whole. And so the memorial is, again, just a permanent structure using these metaphors that will be built in the park. We're fundraising currently. If you know of people who'd be interested in giving or just simply learning more about the project, you can visit breakthesilence.org/memorial. We just launched a new website as well, survivorsmemorial.org. And if not, that's okay too.
So we will open it up to questions, but I realized I forgot one other thing that I wanted to just flag for the advocates on the call. When helping a survivor talk through sharing their story, some do want to and are well within their right to name their perpetrator, to share details that would be identifying, to go that route. And, while it is totally appropriate to talk through potential outcomes of taking that approach. That's absolutely one way that has proven to be very healing for survivors to choose to say their perpetrator's name publicly. Now, at the same time, that does expose them to a level of legal liability as well as potential backlash from family and friends. And so for those that are hesitant to do that, help talk them through using aliases or only first names, excluding things that would be identifying details like geography or the dates something occurred, the fact that it's an ex-husband rather than just saying an ex-partner, that sort of thing. There are ways to mitigate the potential fallout that might occur by limiting the number of people that know the people in the story. So that's another opportunity for, should the survivor or advocacy be looking to get guidance on, I'm happy to help talk through what might be helpful in that situation. With that, do we have any questions, Ty?
No questions.
All right. So we have our contact information for all of you. Here's my personal email address at Standpoint, so you can feel free to email me. I want people to know, we do have 2 Amy's on staff now, even though we only have a staff of 7. We are small, but 2 of us share the same name. So I am Amy at standpointmn.org. The other is Amy I. Again, that's not all that easy to discern when you're looking at it. The 2 of us are very aware that the other one exists, and we know our expertise. So we will always try to find the appropriate Amy with whatever the question or the outreach is. But I just want to flag that for all of you. And you've got my direct dial phone number here. And then, whoops, we just canceled right out of there. Let's do this one more time. And there's Sarah's email as well, if folks want to reach out to her or get involved at all in the Break the Silence Day movement. There are lots of opportunities for advocates, allies, survivors to lend their voice and their activism to this movement. So I think with that, we'll end a little bit early for all of you. Ty, do you want to let them know about the survey?
Yes. So after I close out the webinar, in your email inbox, you will receive a 3-question survey. Please just answer that, and we'll get the responses back. So we look forward to hearing your input so we can continue giving you excellent webinars.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.